Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Jacqueline Maria Musacchio. And her talk tonight, Living with Art in Renaissance Italy, is being presented as part of the Edwin L. Weisl lecture series funded by the Robert Lehman Foundation. I was reflecting yesterday when I was preparing this introduction on the fact that today would be Election Day. I'm wearing proudly my I voted sticker. It's 5 o'clock. The polls in Connecticut, at least, are open for a few more hours. And people are going to be feeling a lot of strong emotions tonight, from excitement to anxiety, myself among them. So I was reflecting on the fact that I was looking forward to knowing there would be an hour's time in which I would be able to relax, disconnect from the news, and focus on looking at and thinking about some Italian Renaissance art, a little bit of calm in the storm. So I hope you too will find some calm with us this evening. This will be an interactive lecture in the sense that you are welcome to drop any questions for Dr. Musacchio in the chat box on thequicklive.com. There's a little bit of a lag at the end, so feel free to put those comments in while she's speaking, and then I'll come back on at the end and share your questions with her. Tonight's speaker is joining us virtually from Massachusetts, where she is Professor of Italian Renaissance and Baroque Art at Wellesley College. Her scholarship, including her books, The Art and Ritual of Childbirth in Renaissance Italy and Art, Marriage, and the Family in the Florentine Renaissance Palace, have focused on the intersection of female experience and material culture from the 14th to early 20th centuries. And her current projects, which examine the women artists who traveled from the US to Italy in the late 19th century, have earned fellowships from the American Philosophical Society, the Friends of the Princeton University Library, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the Eccles Center at the British Library, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. On a personal note, I have been reading Dr. Musacchio's work since I was in graduate school. I drew upon it once again in research for our current exhibition at Fairfield, which is entitled Out of the Kress Vaults, Women in Sacred Renaissance Art. A link to that is being put into our chat box right now. The show itself is on view at Fairfield through December 17th, and we certainly hope you'll stop by if you're local to the area. But if not, you can visit the website for a virtual tour. We hope you'll visit it one way or the other if you're able. So with that show in mind, I was really excited to be able to extend an invitation to Dr. Musacchio to deliver a lecture in connection with this exhibition. And even though circumstances demanded that it be virtual as opposed to in person in Fairfield, I am delighted to welcome her to the screen. So please join me in a virtual round of applause for Dr. Musacchio.
Thank you, Michelle, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for spending part of your election day with me. I'm very grateful to have the chance to share my research with all of you in relation to this exhibition at Fairfield. My talk today is going to be about the domestic context for some of the objects in this exhibition. To me, it's very important that viewers understand these objects as functional objects, as part of daily life, and part of daily life in the Renaissance. And I really hope that my talk will help illustrate that. In August 1447, the Strozzi and Parenti families of Florence agreed to a marriage between their children. They were prominent families, deeply engaged with political and economic events in the city, and the marriage was a very notable event. Caterina Strozzi was 16 years old. She was said to be beautiful, but like most women from this period, little else is known about her. Marco Parenti, however, wrote a chronicle of Florentine history, as well as a lengthy memorandum detailing his lifetime expenses and activities. At the time of his marriage, he was 25, an educated and prosperous merchant, and, fortunately for our purposes, a compulsive record keeper. The case of Caterina and Marco exemplifies how Renaissance Florentines of the middle and upper classes conducted their daily lives where key events like marriages, births, and deaths were accompanied by and mitigated with a broad range of objects, from devotional paintings, of which you see many in this exhibition, to brass thimbles, to widow's veils, to terracotta statuettes, and everything in between. Marriage initiated a household and its accumulation of possessions. Both of these events grew as children were born and shrank when they died, a sad but frequent occurrence in the early modern era, or when they left as adults. Death of the couple then redistributed that household, or in some cases terminated it completely, and the possessions, treasured for their financial value and emotional connotations, were then absorbed into the life of another family, or even families, to start the cycle again. The palaces or homes of Renaissance Florentines that contained these families and their many objects are visible in this contemporary bird's eye view of the city. Their many windowed facades and stacked stories are nestled among both sacred and civic structures inside the fortified city walls, dominated by the dome of Florence Cathedral at the center top, and bisected by the Arno River and its 4 bridges. Florence today looks much as it did then, making it rather easy for us to imagine some aspects of life within those city walls. Unfortunately, however, few palaces retain their original objects, and the objects that do survive are removed from their settings, damaged, or otherwise compromised. This is one reason, of course, that exhibitions like this and collections like the Kress are so vital to our understanding of Renaissance society. Representations in paintings, manuscripts, and other media can help recreate some of these objects, as can personal memoranda, letters, civic legislation, estate inventories, sermons, and popular literature. Taken together, this evidence reveals how Florentines conducted their family life, surrounded by an amazing array of functional, beautiful, instructive, and oftentimes entertaining objects. Since the accumulation of these objects, both devotional and secular, really began with marriage, we need to understand how people married in the Renaissance. In almost every case, the decision to marry was not entrusted to the bride and groom alone. Families, friends, and neighbors all played a part. The stakes to ensure a successful union were very high, as were the expenses. The bride's family had to assemble a suitable dowry, the combination of cash, investments, and goods given by her father to her new husband in her name. The groom and his family then used at least some of these funds to provide a counter dowry, to furnish the couple's home, and to celebrate the marriage in an appropriately public manner. Both dowry and counter-dowry objects came from specialized artisans, tradespeople, secondhand dealers, and even itinerant peddlers, like the one in this engraving, who sleeps while monkeys play with his stock of mirrors, girdles, combs, jewelry, and gloves, all typical bridal items he planned to sell to an eager public. Caterina Strozzi's father provided her with dowry goods that were appraised at 165 florins, or 16.5% of her total 1,000 florin dowry. To put that into perspective, an unskilled laborer in Florence's construction industry might earn about 30 florins a year, so a 1,000 florin dowry was a significant amount. Her dowry goods included many of the objects coveted by the monkeys in this engraving. Her father bought her 5 dresses, as well as 17 lengths of fabric to make even more dresses, and then 17 embroidered shirts, 42 veils, 30 handkerchiefs, a basin and a ewer with heraldic ornament, a book of hours, coral beads, 2 silver-handled knives, a girdle with silver clasps, 6 silk caps, 3 needle cases, an embroidered handkerchief, 2 ivory combs, 9 lengths of thread, 24 caps, a bunch of ribbons, 3 pairs of stockings, 4 baskets, 2 pairs of slippers, 1 pair of shears, and 2 shirt collars. Marco Parenti then spent an equally impressive 560 florins for Caterina's counter dowry, including a lined red silk velvet and fur-trimmed overdress and a matching gown, and a garland for her head made of 800 peacock feathers, much like the one worn by the promenading woman in this detail of a wainscoting panel, a type of painting intended for the upper walls of a bedchamber. Similar objects were cited in other documents and included in portraits that commemorated Florentine brides, like these 3 associated with the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio and his workshop. On the left is Costanza de' Medici with her rings, pins, and thimble. In the middle and at right are Giovanna degli Albizzi and an unfortunately anonymous woman with jewels, books of hours, and paternosters. These objects, visible in these and other painted portraits from this era, indicate that certain expectations and messages were inherent in their accumulation, gifting, and use. On a most basic level, the presence of these objects identified women as brides and wives, while many of them emphasized ideal bridal characteristics like beauty, fertility, piety, and duty. Beauty was enhanced by the extravagant costumes acquired and worn during the marriage process, which included dresses made from luxurious fabrics like these lengths of Florentine velvet. Dress and the messages it sent about an individual's status was an important indicator in Florentine society and sometimes a ruinously expensive part of marriage celebrations. Men who had less money than Marco Parenti borrowed clothing and jewelry for their new wives, hiding their financial status under temporary glitter. Brooches for heads and shoulders, pendants for necks, and jewels for hair, like those shown in these portraits, marked women as the property of their future husbands. Ivory or bone combs, painted, gilt, or carved with figural scenes, helped keep hair controlled, as did hair nets, called by the evocative term vespaio in the inventories, a translation for wasp nest, made of fine silk or metallic threads. Women had mirrors made from small pieces of polished metal or blown glass set in a frame, like the example in a detail from a painting of the Virtue Prudence here on the screen. Other mirrors had ivory or bone frames, while still others were cast from molds, like this maiolica frame, which depended on more expensive models, like this marble frame by the sculptor Mino da Fiesole. In both of these cases, a piece of reflective metal would be attached to the roundel at the bottom of the frame, allowing the woman to see herself and her resemblance to the beautiful woman represented in the frames above. Other objects emphasized the real goal of marriage during this period, which was raising a family. Paintings like this one of a Madonna with the infant Christ by a follower of Piero di Cosimo from the exhibition might be included in a dowry or counter-dowry to remind the bride of her role. Here, the sacred maternal group would be a model for the secular one. In fact, round paintings, or tondi, as they were called, were typical domestic types. Florence, like other cities on the Italian peninsula, was devastated by recurring plague outbreaks in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, reducing the population as much as 1/2 to 2/3. This focused attention on pregnancy and childbirth as a necessary means to perpetuate the family and the city, ensuring a prosperous future. Symbols of fertility, like a belt or girdle, were popular gifts that drew attention to the bride's body. The connection between girdles and fertility is related to the belief that the Virgin's girdle, a precious relic kept in the town of Prato near Florence, was thought to aid women in labor. The girdle shown here, not the Virgin's girdle, but a secular one, is almost 6 feet of woven silk studded with colorful enamels of people and fantastic beasts. The end would have dangled to the ground when buckled, clinking and catching the light when the woman moved. Girdles were so popular that they were made for the open market and appear hanging from racks in representations of goldsmith shops like these two, over the heads of the artisans at left or against the side wall at right, ready for purchase by prospective grooms. As Fairfield's exhibition clearly demonstrates, religion was a key part of the Italian Renaissance. The Piero di Cosimo Tondo is an excellent example of that. And Italy was a predominantly Catholic society, so brides needed to be pious. Illuminated and printed prayer books or books of hours were popular dowry items. But low literacy rates meant that they were often for display rather than reading, with extravagant bindings and clasps, like the two visible in these details from the Ghirlandaio portraits shown earlier. Strings of paternosters or rosaries made of precious metals like coral were also popular dowry items that appeared in painted portraits. And some brides received life-size dolls made of wood, stucco, or terracotta to play with and care for like real children, like the examples carried by the 16th century figures in these paintings. According to contemporary documents, in Florence, bridal dolls often represented the Christ child or a saint, dressed up in extravagant costumes and crowns, but none of those seem to survive intact. Finally, dowry items like the needle case, thimble, and spindle whorls shown here, along with thread, shears, and pins, reminded a woman of her household duties. She needed to tend to family and home via her spinning and sewing. The importance of these duties is enforced by paintings, like this detail from a marriage chest, where the faithful Penelope weaves a shroud for her deceased father-in-law, alongside other scenes from Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey. All of these objects and the beautiful, fertile, pious, and dutiful wife herself traveled through the town from her father's home to that of her new husband, often accompanied by a procession of friends and relations. One of these processions is represented in this fresco. The bride, the figure in red on the white horse, is shown as part of a public ritual that established the new marital alliance to all who saw her pass. She needed a way to transport her dowry goods during this ritual, and this gave rise to the popularity of what we now call marriage chests. We can see another similar procession in this detail from the front of a marriage chest, with an actual chest identified by the painted short end with a rearing horse on it, carried on the back of the straining servant to the far right of your screen. Here again, we can use the example of Marco Parenti and Caterina Strozzi to understand Florentine practice. Marco's careful memoranda indicate that he bought various chests of different sizes, though none can be identified today. Like Marco, most men also sent their future brides small caskets or chests filled with some of the objects I just described. These caskets might be simple, like the unpainted wooden example on the painting detail at top left, or they could be made of carved ivory or bone, as at the bottom left, or shaved wood, carved around a base, capped with a matching lid, and painted with romantic themes, as top right. Or they might have applied molded gesso, called pastiglia, like the casket at bottom right. Although Marco Parenti noted the purchase of at least one small casket, he didn't describe its appearance or contents, and his meticulous accounts only describe the construction, not the paintings, of Caterina's larger pair of marriage chests. The wood, the gilding, and the size were what determined the price. One subject would have cost the same as another, so Marco, like so many Florentine men documenting their marriage expenses, felt no need to describe the paintings at any detail. These larger chests varied in appearance, but usually had instructive images on front and side related to the ideal behavior of a Renaissance bride, or sometimes her groom or future children. Some had applied ornament, like this one with tournament scenes. Around the time of Caterina and Marco's marriage chests were usually painted and sometimes gilt on all sides. This partially reconstructed example from nearby Siena is painted with a procession of love and chastity. Sometimes we only have the front panels, like these three here, with scenes from mythology and Roman history. Some chests were painted with subjects related to the virtues expressed in the dowry and counter-dowry objects we saw earlier, like the story of Diana at the top, which advocated chastity for the bride. At middle and bottom, the stories of Trajan and the Trojan War instead dictate virtuous behavior for the groom. This is a rare surviving example of an almost intact and quite extravagant marriage chest, painted with a contemporary battle scene. Its inner lid, shown in black and white in the reproduction at left, is painted to resemble expensive fabric. Other chests have paintings of nude or nearly nude couples in the inner lids. Like these two, the figures serving as hidden talismans to encourage sexuality and procreation, only visible when wife or husband open the chest to retrieve the items stored inside. Side panels were also painted to continue or respond to the narrative on the long front panels, like these of Apollo and Daphne and Paramus and Thisbe. Florentine artists were eager to showcase their skills and increase their incomes by producing marriage chests to meet demand, and the great variety and beauty of these objects gives us a good sense of how colorful a Florentine bedchamber would have been, as well as how didactic these images were intended to install ideal behavior. Marco Parenti's purchase for his marriage to Caterina Strozzi were completed by early 1448, when he gave Caterina a ring and they agreed to be husband and wife in front of witnesses. A similar ceremony might be represented in this detail from a marriage chest panel of the Triumph of David, where a couple face each other surrounded by a group of onlookers, meant to represent Old Testament figures but dressed in Renaissance costume. Most marriage rings have been lost, melted down, or reworked for other purposes in the intervening centuries. But we know women often had several, as seen in this detail from a portrait I showed you earlier in my talk. One example that does survive is this pyramid-cut diamond in a gold setting, inscribed along the hoop, Lorenzo to Lena Lena. The woman's name was probably a shortened form or a nickname for her given name, Elena or Maddalena, and it may have been inscribed twice as a term of endearment or perhaps to fit with Lorenzo's longer name on the other side of the hoop. This silver ring, inscribed with the names Caterina and Nicola, may fit into this marriage category as well. Other rings had romantic inscriptions, clasped hands, or profile heads like this one, and they all seem to indicate an association with love and marriage. In Renaissance Florence, the ring ceremony was followed by a banquet with a variety of foods and desserts and wines, and even in some cases wafers, made from flour, sugar, and eggs, heated in a fire between two iron forms. The detail at the bottom left from a Flemish manuscript includes a woman at a hearth holding a set of irons in one hand and the wafer she made with them in the other. An example of these irons used to make such wafers is at top. The paddles of the irons were ornamented with floral, figurative, or geometric designs, and some had particular inscriptions, names, or heraldry. The irons shown here have the names Renzo and Lucia Pacca and the date 1481, presumably the year that they married, as well as a romantic inscription. This representation of a wedding banquet by the painter Sandro Botticelli is especially fantastic, but still indicative of the great pomp and expense that could be associated with these events. Botticelli's painted banquet took place in an open loggia around a credenza piled high with costly gold and silver plate, with food carried over to the tables by servants in livery to feed the ostentatiously dressed guests. The bride is seated at the left in white, with a servant placing food in front of her. Like the procession through town with dowry goods, an elaborate celebration like this would have solidified the bonds between families in a visible manner. Public display guaranteed the future of the union. But celebrations, of course, were ephemeral. So the palace where the couple lived, when this public part of the ritual was over, and where they kept all of the objects we've been discussing, served as a much more permanent status symbol. The money spent on these palaces enhanced the reputation of the family in a constant public manner. Marco Parenti was luckier than most men because he was an only son and due to inherit his family's palace. So he brought Caterina there to live. But he still had to furnish their living spaces, and he recorded the purchase of many large beds and chests, various devotional objects, and other items to do so in his memoranda. The bedchamber was the center of activity and the site of gatherings of friends, family, and business associates during the Renaissance. It was not our idea of a private chamber. It was therefore the ideal place to keep the family's most precious possessions. The most expensive piece of furniture for the new home and the most important item in any bedchamber, from both a literal and a dynastic standpoint, was the couple's bed. Some Renaissance beds, like the one on the left, had large platforms with high headboards and surrounding chests that could hold multiple sleepers, while daybeds, like the one on the right, were long, narrow benches with high wooden backs and sides, wide enough for only a single person. But both were outfitted with precious textiles and ornamented with intarsia, paint, or even attached paintings, which could be as provocative as Botticelli's Venus and Mars, where the lounging figures, rather like the reclining nudes on the inner lids of the marriage chests, were meant to encourage a couple to think about fertility and procreation. Many men acquired a sacred, or at least a quasi-sacred object to sanctify and protect their homes, to serve as a focus for devotion, and to mediate between their families and the outside world. Renaissance Florentines, or indeed Renaissance citizens throughout Italy, were accustomed to art all around them in both public and domestic settings. Their government buildings, and especially their churches, monastic complexes, and convents, were filled with representations of God the Father, Christ, the Madonna, and a legion of saints, many of which were considered special patrons of particular institutions or even particular cities and families. The painting of St. Ursula by Manazzo Gozzoli in the exhibition includes a nun kneeling and praying on a different scale from the saint, representing the donor who funded the painting, which was likely installed in a church or convent setting. In the domestic context, most commonly, the devotional objects acquired for homes at the time of marriage represented a variation on the Madonna and Child theme, often in the round or tondo format, like the Piero di Cosimo we saw earlier. Michelangelo's Pitti Tondo, represented in the exhibition by this plaster cast of the original marble from Florence's Bargello Museum, and this Tondo on the right of the Madonna and Child and a young John the Baptist, attributed to Andrea del Sarto, were also originally meant for domestic interiors. Some men received devotional paintings and sculptures like these as inheritance, as a gift, or as a loan from their fathers, or as part of their wives' dowries, while others purchased them directly. We know that Marco Parenti brought a Madonna relief as part of the preparations for his marriage. Many artists, or at least their workshops, made devotional objects like this on commission or in multiples, meeting that inquisitive nature of the merchant society as easily and as inexpensively as possible. As I noted earlier, the intimate representation of mother and child in these objects also served as encouragement for pregnancy and childbirth. Children were the real reason behind marriage and behind many of these objects. And by children, they really meant boys, since this was a patriarchal society and boys continued the family while girls were married off to continue someone else's family. To encourage procreation, beginning in the 1370s, new wives received wooden childbirth trays to encourage, celebrate, and commemorate childbirth. The front might be painted with mythological, literary, or biblical iconography, or even, as seen in this example, with a new mother in her bedchamber following the birth itself. The back of this tray might have a coat of arms, a checkerboard, or even, as here at right, a talismanic image of a naked boy playing with a whirligig and urinating a silver and gold stream toward the viewer. Such an image was a prompt to help a woman create her own son. Ancient and Renaissance theories of sympathetic magic insisted that looking at something could create it in the womb. A woman was therefore warned not to look at toads or other beasts before and during pregnancy, in case the power of sympathetic magic resulted in birth defects or even what was considered a monstrous birth. Instead, she should look at representations of little boys to ensure she created one herself. And both birth trays and bowls, as well as marriage chests, were deliberately painted with these representations to help her. At times, these naked boys were especially active. This example has two engaged in a battle, one pulling on the penis of the other, in what must have been the illustration of a popular adage that it seems lost to us today. By the early 16th century, wooden bowls with related images painted in their concavities and undersides were also used, like this example representing the naming of St. John the Baptist. At the same time, tin-glazed earthenware, or maiolica, was also popular, whether Tuscan examples with stylized representations of swaddled infants, like the example at the top, or historiated maiolica from central Italy with bedchamber or even childbirth scenes, like the footed bowl at the bottom, the interior with a woman on her birthing stool surrounded by female attendants on the left, and a side view of that same bowl on the right. All of these trays and bowls were used to serve or carry food and drink to the new mother after childbirth, when she also received embroidered nightshirts, lace bed caps, and special linens, and when she entertained the many well-wishers to her bedchamber with wine and candies. And these objects then remained in the home as a treasured possession for years to come. After children were born, they needed assistance to get through the potential trauma of their early years. The first and most basic form of protection was provided by the sacrament of baptism, a ritual with sacred, familial, and even civic components, since the city of Florence was under the protection of John the Baptist. Baptismal sponsors, or godparents, gave mother and child lengths of cloth, goblets, food, coins, and special forks and spoons and holders. Following baptism, the newborn was often sent to a wet nurse in the countryside for several years, and that occasion triggered the accumulation of another type of dowry, one made of objects to keep the child safe, warm, and comfortable while at the wet nurse. like swaddling, linens, caps, amulets, cribs, and even silver rattles, like this example with a fantastic beast and glittering bells and whistles. Florentines acquired these objects in great quantities, but the church saw such extravagance, like the banquet represented in Botticelli's painting we looked at earlier, as harmful to the soul. A friar from the 1420s asked, how can one describe the luxuries which one might often find not only in the palaces of the great, but in the homes of the common citizens? Consider the size and softness of the beds. There you will find silken and linen sheets with borders of fine gold embroidery, precious coverlets, painted and provocative of lust, and gilded and painted curtains. Other religious figures warned against this kind of luxury too, whether sacred or secular, encompassing food, clothing, carpets, tapestries, metalware, or ceramics, all of the precious objects that made up a Renaissance home. But none of these warnings were very effective because Florentines were not penalized for the accumulation of objects where it might have affected them the most. They were not asked to report the value of their household furnishings on their tax declarations, so they did not pay taxes on them and could take advantage of domestic display as an outlet for their supplemental income. Florentines treasured their objects and the messages that their objects sent to their fellow citizens. So the government, made up of men with some of the highest incomes and the most splendid palaces, did not ask its citizens to relinquish them. The palaces of prosperous Florentine families, their red-tiled rooftops scattered throughout this frescoed city view, provided an ideal setting for families and the objects associated with them. Within one of these palaces, surrounded by these objects, Marco Parenti and Caterina Strozzi enjoyed the charmed life of the Florentine elite. They raised their children, married them off, and prospered financially. But this ended in 1481, after 34 years of marriage, when Marco recorded Caterina's death in his memoranda. A Florentine wife was usually younger than her husband. Caterina was 9 years Marco's junior, and if she survived her childbearing years, as Caterina did, she often ended her days as a widow. According to tax records, a quarter of all adult women in Florence were widows in the late 15th century. So Caterina's death was probably unexpected. Marco recorded it alongside his entry on their marriage on the first page of his memoranda book. For a merchant accustomed to double entry bookkeeping, this made sense because her death closed her account. Marco provided his female relations with lengths of brown wool to make their mourning garments, which they wore for a period of time out of respect. And he gave Caterina an honorable burial in his family tomb. Death might give the objects associated with a wife a sentimental quality. This painting of a young man gazing at a brooch could be a husband remembering his deceased wife by her favorite jewelry. The brooch, in the shape of a pelican pecking her breast, symbolized Christ's passion and sacrificial love, and therefore maternal love, too. It was a popular motif, as the surviving brooch at right indicates, and probably an ideal gift for a young bride or new mother. Like the man in this painting, Marco apparently did mourn Caterina, though, like many widowers from his era, he was perhaps more practical than sentimental. He made back some of the costs of her counter dowry, those beautiful clothes and that wonderful peacock garland I mentioned earlier, by selling what remained through the secondhand dealer market. Objects associated with family rituals, like Caterina's celebratory clothing, as well as some of the furniture, painting, sculpture, and other objects I've shown you today, were always in demand. So if they were not passed on to heirs, they were easily sold on this market. Few things were so inconsequential that they lacked resale potential, although they sometimes had to be transformed to make them appropriate for a new setting. The front of the childbirth tray here on the left was painted with a Petrarchan triumph of love for a Florentine marriage around the year 1460. But its back, shown on the right, was repainted with a new heraldic device in 1537, indicating it was either handed down through the family or sold to celebrate a new marriage after the original couple no longer needed it. Marco Parenti never remarried, although his wealth and social status would have made him a very good catch. He outlived Caterina by 16 years, and after a long and prosperous life, he died in 1497. Domestic objects, like those he bought for his family palace and those I've shown you today, united Florentine citizens. The contents of their palaces, like those shown in this woodcut, provided a comforting and recognizable setting for the great emphasis on family life that flourished during this era. While most objects were utilitarian, a great many were also aesthetically pleasing and oftentimes didactic. And it is this diverse group, the devotional paintings, the intarsiated beds, the marriage chests and the birth trays, and things like that, that reveal so much about Florentine life and love. These objects, accumulated and preserved with such care and now part of so many collections like the Kress, give us a vivid understanding of Renaissance family life. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was a wonderful presentation, and I'm taking a lot of notes. I know we have some questions from the audience that are going to be sent through to us in the chat, but I take the privilege of being able to ask you my questions first. And since I'm more familiar with the context of Renaissance Venice, I was wondering, and I'm trying to rack my memory, was there ever any effort at creating sumptuary laws, like actual laws limiting the amount of ostentation that could be in a Florentine home? So you said they didn't have to report tax value, but was there ever a time, for example, under Savonarola, where there was this idea that you could not legally have that level of collecting?
There were plenty of sumptuary laws for Florence, just like there were in Venice. In Venice, we have great documentary evidence for them as well. And in Venice, they controlled everything from, the occasion of childbirth to marriage to everything in between. But in Florence, they didn't quite, the tax issue was one thing, but I think it was just too important to have these kinds of objects in your home to legislate against them. And so you don't have that kind of explicit denunciation of these objects. You had it in a more informal way through, as you said, Savonarola and his sort of period of rule in the 1490s, where people were very much encouraged to give up their jewelry, their books, their works of art. And we have kind of anecdotal evidence of even artists throwing their works of art on the bonfire, the vanities that were done by Savonarola and his followers. But we didn't have that those kind of limitations placed on household objects like these through sumptuary laws in Florence.
As a follow-up question, with the exception of that marriage procession, which is very public, these objects would largely have been sort of for the semi-public or semi-private space of the home. So you kind of aren't really showing off until people are allowed to come inside, who are ostensibly of the same social class as you, right?
Right. You're allowing people into your home to see these kinds of things. In a way, you're showing off when you do it. But it's always important to remember that our idea of privacy is a very different idea of privacy than what they had in the Renaissance, right? So you would have lots of people in your home. You would have people in your bedchamber. You would invite people in and they would see these amazing things. We're talking about the middle to upper classes doing this, but still it was, the domestic interior was a much more public setting than we might think today. So I think it's still
early 15th century friar who knew how soft everyone's beds were in order to complain about it. Speaking of class, we had a question here from Britt who said, you mentioned that both the upper and lower classes would have ornate items in their homes. If the elite could afford all of the items, but those of lesser means could only afford a few, did they have preferences? Were there items that were more favored by those of lesser means?
That's a really great question. Looking through inventories from this time period, and inventories usually made at the death of someone who died without a will. So the government authorities would go in and make these inventories. I was always surprised that even, someone who seemed to be by their profession of relatively lower on the social scale would still have things like mattresses, would still have special sheets, might still have something designated for marriage or for childbirth, because those objects are usually designated as such in the inventories. They wouldn't have nearly the kind of extravagant ones that are the ones that survive today, but they would often have at least a few pieces that would surprise me. Right? You would think those kind of things would be the first to go on the secondhand market if you needed to sell them or whatever. But I think it indicated how important these kinds of objects were to people. So, you wouldn't have sort of elaborate, large paintings by a relatively well-known artist, but you'd still have a Madonna, right? Almost every bedchamber would have a Madonna in it. And we don't know what that Madonna would always look like. I suspect many of them were cast, were terracotta or clay or plaster made from cast, so they could be made cheaply. But there was a surprising number of objects in almost every household that was inventoried.
I'm sure that has something to do with the fact that there was just a rising tide of affluence in Florence as also in
Yeah,
this period. So not that, everyone is sharing in it, but certainly
right,
there's, that
right.
spread among the population.
Well, and a big part of it, of course, being that with the decimation of the plague, money gets put into fewer hands, and so it
Mhm.
does, ironically, elevate certain members of the Florentine citizenry in ways it wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, I thought that was such a great point that you make that, these repeated plagues and what had happened to the population meant that it is not just sort of, oh, yes, have children, but really like you must have children. They must survive to
Mhm.
adulthood. It's so important. Melissa asks, was there any specific percentage that the dowry had to be from the groom or bride's families, respectively?
Um, I don't think there was ever any sort of absolute stated percentage given, but depending on your social status, this was public knowledge, right? And as you paraded through the town, people would see you. So you needed to put up a pretty good showing, and word got out of what you were spending. So um, it was Katerina and Marco's case was a great example of kind of the what I looked at as people kind of stretching to, spend a significant amount of money to make a really good impression. They were both from good families, but it still was an astonishing array of items. And, I gave the list of what was in her dowry down to, things like bits of thread and ribbons and everything else, and up to velvet gowns. So there was quite a lot of objects. And I think that um, a big part of that was due to the fact that you're wearing your wealth on your back if you're a woman. You're wearing your family's wealth on your back if you're a woman during this period. And she became an item of display whenever she went out of the house. So it was important to spend quite a lot of money on her if you could afford to do so, or even if you couldn't and had to borrow the finery for that period while she was still a bride.
And following up on that, you mentioned how many of these, if they were unused objects at the death of there's no one to be handed on to,
Mm-hmm.
that Marco sold some of them on the secondhand market.
Mm-hmm.
Was there ever the expectation that the bride's family would get some of that dowry, those dowry objects back if she died?
Not really. If she died, there were cases where her dowry would have to, the financial part of the dowry would have to go back. But the goods, the objects were often, consumed in some way, right? They were worn out. So there wasn't a overall expectation that all of that would go back. But if she died young enough, immediately, then there was some hope that yes, some of that money would go back, and maybe then it would be used for her sister to be married
Mm.
off, right?
So Dana Rene asked, well, she says, thank you for a fantastic lecture. Are certain myths for women's wedding chests and birthing related materials more popular in certain cities?
Mm-hmm. Well, Florence is the place where we have the most documentation for both surviving objects and documented um, references for marriage chests and birth trays. But they were also done throughout other towns in Tuscany. And we know that the Maiolica bowls for childbirth were also done throughout central Italy as well. For some reason, Florence really, and it can't just be an accident of survival, Florence really kind of ran with this trend, and we have the most evidence for Florence, whether it's because of the very active artist and artisan population who can create these objects, or because it had reasoning, some kind of reasoning behind it regarding social life and expectations. We don't really know, but other cities did it to a certain extent, and places like Venice continue to do it for centuries after this as well. So we know that there's an interest in keeping this active, this sort of habit active for many, many years. It's just a question of when we're going to, how we can identify the objects or not.
And of course, so many of the objects that have survived are from those elites of Florentine society. But
Exactly.
Janet would like to ask, what about the lower class? What was their life like, and what objects were important to them?
Yeah, we can often tell things like, there's fantastic childbirth trays. Like there's a tray that belonged to the Medici family, probably almost certainly made for the birth of Lorenzo de' Medici, which I didn't show you, but which is at the Met in New York. On the other hand, there are trays that are kind of a little bit beat up and a little bit generic. Here at Wellesley, we have a fabulous tray with a Triumph of Love, but it's clearly not an extravagant tray. It was clearly made for a market that was several tiers below what the Medici would have bought. What we would think of as sort of an off-the-rack purchase, right? Someone would go into the shop and buy it, and it couldn't have cost that much money. It wasn't as large, didn't have gilding, and so on and so forth. So we know that there definitely were objects to accommodate up and down the social scale and the needs up and down the social scale. But as you're saying, what survives tends to be the more extravagant, the more elaborate, the ones with better materials, the ones that were worth more then and, by virtue of their materials, continue to be worth quite a lot. So it's hard to really get at what things would have looked like for those lower down the social scale. Documentary evidence is great, but it's not tangible, right? So we can't exactly replicate what they had.
And Andrew has a survival related question. He asks, would objects destroyed by the relatively frequent floods in Florence have been replaced by similar items, or was opportunity ever taken to become more contemporary?
That's an interesting question. Certainly, if you walk around Florence today, you can often see on the sides of buildings little sort of lines that say, in 15 whatever, the flood reached this height. So undoubtedly, people lost possessions, on a very regular basis due to the Arno flooding. I don't know what would have happened then, though. I'd like to think that if it was a relatively young family, recently married or still having children, they would go and they would buy more of these kinds of objects. And if they could afford it, I think they probably would buy them new. If not, they'd go on the secondhand market to get them. And as I said, the secondhand market was so active. But then again, if it's flooding, it's probably flooding the shops of the secondhand dealers too, right?
Well, funny
So
is I'm thinking that, if the shops are on the ground floor, they're the
yeah,
ones probably
exactly.
getting flooded first. The noble
Exactly.
families are living on the upper floors. They might have been
Right.
okay.
Right.
So if
Right.
anything, yes, the poorer people would have been probably more dramatically affected by those
Yeah.
floods.
Yeah. People living closer to the Arno, um, thinking of where the artisan shops were that would have made a lot of these objects, they would be sort of closer to the Duomo, a bit further away from the Arno. But yeah, the flood reached all levels of Florence. I think are we still looking at the last slide? I don't know.
Yes.
If we're still looking at the last slide here, you can see the town is bisected by the Arno. And so you've got the flooding extending quite far, surprisingly far throughout the city. Even the 1966 flood, which is the one people mostly think of now today, the photographs from it are terrifying. And you can see how far the water extended. So, and that's with mitigation efforts. So there were no mitigation efforts really, right, in the Renaissance. So it must have decimated quite a lot of the center of the city. And yes, lots of people would have lost things and lots of shops would have lost things. So it's hard to know how they would have been able to replace them then.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question about the marriage chests, which I'd also noted when you were speaking, because our Kress collection at Fairfield, that is one that is not part of this exhibition, is an end panel from a Cassone, marriage chest. And the
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, there's another one. It's linked to one that's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but it's one of those questions where the narrative that's being told, no one has ever been able to identify, and we are missing the long side, which might have been sort of the key tying them together. But Frank wants to know, do we know who the chess painters were, and was that a particular specialization among artists?
Yes, it was. We know lots of artists painted chess, and we know lots of artists made things up and down, what we would call, high and low art today. So there were artists who specialized in it, artists like Apollonia di Giovanni, who's one of the best documented marriage chess painters, but he also made devotional panels and he made things like hat racks and everything else. But also other artists that we can identify who we think more of as monumental painters also made marriage chests. So we can identify quite a lot of them, not only through connoisseurship, but through documents and through comparison to their more monumental work. So it's actually a really interesting way to think about the way that artists were able to survive in this period. They had extensive workshops, and they might be working on major commissions for an altarpiece in a church, but they've got workers in their workshops who have to keep busy, and they also don't get a commission for an altarpiece in a church all the time. So they could make marriage chests, or they can make birth trays, or they can make portraits. But the market for these kinds of objects that so many families needed and wanted was steady. It was a steady stream of income. And so even if it's an artist we're thinking of as a more monumental painter, almost certainly he, is also making these other objects in large part to just have a steady income.
Yeah. Diversifying the revenue streams, right? It was a good advice
Yes,
then.
in modern terms, exactly.
Well, I think that's all of our questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Musacchio, for sharing all of this wonderful information and these images with us this evening. I know we have all benefited from this. And again, if you're in the Connecticut area and you want to come see the show, it is up through December 17th. We're open Tuesday through Saturday from 11 to 4. And again, a virtual round of applause to Dr. Musacchio for her talk tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Michelle.